Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Alliance for Water Efficiency webinar. My name is Marianne Dickinson. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our webinar. Today, we are covering software solutions to help manage water conservation programs. This is part of our Innovations in Water Efficiency series, where we feature our business and industry members who are developing products and services that are very helpful to managing and designing and implementing water conservation programs. And today we're very pleased to feature two of our AWE members in this webinar. First, though, we'd like to give you a little bit of logistical instruction. This webinar will be 60 minutes in length. We will strive to be 60 minutes or under. We have scripted time for questions in this webinar. The audio that you will use is either through your telephone or your computer, one or the other. If you're hearing my voice, you have obviously figured it out, so that's good. But we will be muting the phone line and the computer audios during this presentation because we are recording it. We record all of our webinars so that they're available to our members and interested parties to look at later. And this recording will be available in a few days or so. We'll talk about that at the end of the webinar. But just because we're muting the phone line doesn't mean we don't want you to participate. We are very interested in having you engage with us and ask our speakers questions, which you can type throughout the webinar as they are speaking. And we'll answer all of your questions at the end of the presentations. The way you access the chat box is in the upper right-hand corner of your computer screen. There is an orange rectangle with a white arrow. If you click on that, it will open up a dialog box where you can type in your questions. And Liam, our webinar master, will be receiving everyone's questions, and we will address them in the order that they were received. So you can feel free to type them as you think of them during the presentation. We encourage you to do so. We think that's one of the best parts of the webinar is our ability to answer the questions that you might have. So who are our webinar speakers? We are very happy to have a suite of speakers that will talk with you today. Our first speaker will be JP Joly, who is the co-founder of WaterWorth. And he will talk to you about the company and about the product that he will be describing to you. We also will be featuring Steve Weitzel, who is a principal for Radian Developers, and Russ Horner, who is the president for Water Management, Inc. So those will be our speakers today. And the first thing I'd like to do is just tell you a little bit about them. JP has more than 15 years of experience working with municipal water and wastewater utilities, building models for asset management, long-term financial planning, utility rate setting, and other programs related to long-term sustainability. He leads WaterWorth's product development effort, and you'll hear about that today. Steve Weitzel is the principal and founder of Radian Developers. This is a company that has worked on data collection, analytics, and billing data with water engineers, conservation managers, municipalities, universities, and nonprofits for over a decade. He also works and builds websites. If you're familiar with the AWE's Home WaterWorks website, you are familiar with Steve's work. Russ Horner is the president of Water Management, Inc., which is a firm that he co-founded in 1980. And for the past 30 years, he's been responsible for auditing, pricing, designing, and implementing many of the company's thousands of guaranteed savings programs. He also trains municipalities in water conservation auditing. So I'm very pleased to have this distinguished group of speakers working with us today, and I'd like to turn it over to start to JP, who will talk to us about WaterWorth.
Okay, thank you, Marianne. And you can go to the next slide. So, as you mentioned, I've been consulting since probably way back in 2005 and helping water systems with a variety of things like rate studies and water conservation planning, communications, and really just helping their decision-making process. Next slide. And through that whole time and working with these managers, I come to see that you guys are really in this kind of situation, stuck between a rock and a hard place. Next slide. So on the one hand, if you aren't charging enough, and we see this across North America, and many of you who are on the call, maybe things aren't this bad for you, but you get the idea. Without funding, you just can't keep things in good shape. Next slide. On the other hand, if you're overcharging, or it's more like you're being seen to be overcharging, because not everybody gets what's going on behind the scenes, but then you might have to face what we affectionately call the angry mob, and we'd like to try to avoid that. So it's complicated. Next slide. And because it's complicated, we know that a lot of water managers don't deal with it. They kick it down the road, and it turns into chronic underfunding, you know, what we saw just a second ago. And but on the other hand, you might even enlist the help of rate consultants, get rate studies done. That's what I've been doing for about 15 years. And those rate studies can be, in many cases, can be overly complex. They tend to generate, you know, 40 or even 80-page documents that are hard to read. And these documents are typically out of date almost the moment they come off the printer. And as you know, if you've done rate studies, they can be expensive. And we reached a point where we just thought there has to be a better way to do this. You know, a lot of our customers would even ask us if they could borrow our models, which were all based out of Microsoft Excel. And many of you who use Excel would know, and you would cringe at the thought of giving somebody your very complex and brittle spreadsheets. So not a good approach either. So next slide. What we did is we came up with WaterWorth, and we took all of that know-how and consulting expertise and all those spreadsheets, and we bundled them up into an online software tool that we call WaterWorth. And it's just like anything else that you might use online, like Facebook, you know, or your online banking and that sort of thing. You log in, you subscribe, and you log in. Okay, next slide. So the way it works is you subscribe to our software and our services. We help you to upload your data, and there's a variety of different types of data sets, and you don't have to put it all in all at once. We help you to analyze what's going on. You can share your model amongst yourselves, with your boards or your council. You can, because it's an online tool, you can work on it from wherever you want. And the idea is that unlike the traditional, you know, rate study approach, you keep your model up to date. And so every year, as your new fiscal year rolls over and you close out your previous year, you bring in your new numbers, and you know that your model is always going to be able to tell you what you need to know when you ask it some questions. And the best part of it all is our support model. So we provide lots and lots of support to our customers, and not just things like how do you use the tool and where do you put the numbers, but things like how do you think about you know, future capital reinvestment budgets, and how do you think about developing cash reserve policies, and how do you have those conversations with your team and with your elected officials. So so the support is pretty deep and pretty comprehensive. Next slide. So many of you probably have a copy of this sitting on your desk, and so you know that, again, this reaffirms how things are complex when you're thinking about financing water systems and thinking about rates. We've relied heavily on much of the methodology in here, and we've also departed from some of the methodology in a variety of cases. And so next slide, if you turn to the first few pages of that document, you'll see that there's really 3 phases of work when you're trying to manage your finances and your rates. There's really, and I like to use the analogy of a pie to explain it. So first of all, how big should the pie be? How much money do you need, not just for next year's budget, but for the long term? And our model looks out 25 years. So because your projects, you know, can sometimes be 10 years out, it would be good to know what that impact has. So we look at full cost recovery, and we help you to first figure out your revenue requirements. How big should the pie be? The next phase of work is typically about a cost of service, and that's about divvying up that pie into its pieces. Who should pay for what? You might have residential, you might have commercial customers, agricultural, industrial, and the list goes on. And so that would be the second phase. And then the third phase of work tends to be the rate design. Not often do you restructure your rates, but there may be cases where you're thinking of, what if we added another tier? What if we changed our tier thresholds? What if we changed our base rates for commercial but not for residential? You know, those kinds of things can turn into some tricky math, and so that's all done under the rate design phase of work. So those are the kind of the 3 main elements. Next slide. So when you log into WaterWorth, you see that same thing. You've got these three panels here. You've got your long-term financial model on the left, your cost of service model in the middle, and then your rate designer on the right. And what you're seeing here is a scenario, and you can develop as many scenarios as you want. And the best thing about WaterWorth is it's all done with pictures. So, you know, we've put away that 80-page document full of numbers and tables that's hard to read, and we've done things graphically because we found out that people tend to learn and absorb things better graphically. They can see what happens if you do this and what happens if you do that when the picture changes right before their eyes. Next slide. So everybody needs one of these. This is our centerpiece of our tool. So this is the financial model, and yes, it looks complex, but we can turn layers on and off. And so when we're having a conversation with council, let's say, we just bring in the layers one at a time, and we pull layers in and out, and the whole picture is right there in front of you, including the punchline, which is on the right-hand side. That's the thing that we're asking council to do, is increase rates over time, and this is how we're going to propose to increase them. And we can use the picture to explain why it has to be that way, or we can explore different ways of doing it by changing the numbers and seeing the picture change its shape, and that just enhances the conversation that you'll have and makes it far more efficient. Next slide. So we talked about, you know, being able to build multiple scenarios, and that's often important because there's, you know, usually many different ways of dealing with the same things. So WaterWorth helps you to do that really quick. We can very easily bring data in and out of the tool with either direct input or dragging or cutting and pasting from Excel, and we even have the ability to drag and drop specially formatted Excel sheets right on top of WaterWorth, and data automatically gets onboarded easily that way. Next slide. So another data set that's important and critical in long-term sustainability has to do with your assets. And WaterWorth, if you can bring in your asset inventory into WaterWorth, you can use it to look, you know, this is a 100-year time frame, and to see when are things really coming due for replacement. You know, or what should what's our annual cost of sustainable ownership, and what should our future capital reinvestment budget be, and all the way to things like capital reserves and those kinds of conversations. So again, pictures help that process very well. Next slide. So let's bring in your billing data and do some stuff with that. Depending on your billing system, that could be a little trickier to do. But once you go through the hard yards of getting your billing data into WaterWorth, you can do all kinds of really fancy and great calculations, really good insights. Next slide. Programming and a rate structure in WaterWorth is very easy. The simple ones take less than a minute. The more complex ones might take 4 or 5 minutes to do. We've not run into any rate structure out there that has confounded our rate editor. There's all kinds of flexibility and lots of power. And this is the thing that really is where the rubber meets the road. You like to see what happens if you change your rates, and what happens to your overall picture. So very powerful, again, graphically, very powerful to use. Next slide. And the things that, you know, elected officials want to know is, how does it impact your revenues? And next slide. And really, what is the impact on your customers when you do this or you do that? And again, it's all graphical. So you know, we're not dealing with numbers here. We're dealing with pictures that you can see, and the more important thing is you can see the pictures move when you change things, and that's where you get a sense as to how sensitive your financial outlook is when you want to play around with what if this and what if that. Next slide. So I can't stress that the best part of our offering is not the tool so much, but the professional support that comes with it. So we work by your side the whole time. You get as much time, you know, as much of our time as you need, whether it's through the live chat. We do one-on-one session screen sharing, and you know, we measure success for ourselves when you can successfully get outcomes on your side, and that usually means having counsel going through a great experience of decision making. You know, even if the decisions are hard, you know, getting a good decision by counsel is a success. Next slide. So we've made things easy. You know, we've made it easy to get your data into the tool. We make it easy for you to use the tool. We promise greater efficiency in how you're going to get to do things. And you know, I was just on a call with a water utility manager just a couple days ago, and she was considering buying WaterWorth, and you know, and one of the biggest objections is, well, I just don't have the time. I'm short on resources, short on staff. I don't know that I can devote the time needed for this. So I asked her, how much time do you think it would take for you to get a baseline financial model up and running? And she said, well, probably 30 to 60 hours. And we, you know, our WaterWorth promise is it would take you 2 hours if you can get your key financial data together, and that's expenses, operating expenses, your revenues, your capital plan, your debt servicing schedule, and your cash. If you can get those 5 things pulled together, I promise you I can get you up and running with the baseline model in under 2 hours. And I've done it again and again and again. So it doesn't take much time to do. Next slide. And one of the best parts is, so so here I'm showing you that the financial data, 2 hours. There's a couple of other data sets you can see here: population, water production, billing, and asset inventory. So these are all other data sets that you eventually can layer into WaterWorth, but you don't need to do that to get a baseline financial model in place, which can help you, you know, drive the overall picture. Next slide. And here's one of the best parts. So we've made sure to make this really cheap and highly procurable. So with this price point, you generally don't need to go to through a costly effort of going through an RFP process, and you know, the professional services package is optional after year 1. But we find that most people renew that because, as I said before, our support is one of the best parts of the whole deal. And don't just take my word for it. I would send you off to talk to any number of our customers who would tell you the same thing. Next slide. And here they all are. So we're spread across much of the US and across Canada as well. We're still working into some of the states, but again, I would happily send you off to any one of our happy customers to find out how their experience has been working with WaterWorth. Next slide. But wait, there's more. So right now, and you know, largely because of the whole virus issue, we've been offering a 90-day free trial. So you don't even really need to go to ask your boss for the permission to spend the $5,000 for the tool. You can get started. You just have to devote a couple hours of your time, and you get on the phone with me, and I extend my WaterWorth promise that I would get you up and running with a baseline model in 2 hours or less, and you can play around with the tool for 90 days, no strings attached. And if at the end of that 90 days you still find that WaterWorth's not for you, no problem. You just send me a nice email saying thank you but no thanks, and I will be happy and you'll be happy too. All right, last slide. So if you need a couple of takeaways here, the key takeaway here is you've got nothing to lose to try WaterWorth, except for a couple of hours of your time, and even then I promise you'll learn something through that process. If you don't have a model, you really need to think that through, because everybody needs a model that looks at least 10, if not 20, 25 years out. You need a model. Come and find us and we'll help you out with that. If you already have a model, do it anyway. You might find that WaterWorth can enhance the way you've been doing things, or you might find that your model is as good or better than WaterWorth, in which case would be good to know. And I still promise you'll discover and learn something through the process. So do it anyway, and you'll have a nice comparison, you know, WaterWorth compared to your model, and see what that turns out. So that's good. Marianne, thanks so much, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, JP. Really appreciate your presentation, and I hope the folks out there listening will take you up on your offer. A 90-day free trial sounds terrific. So if you have questions for JP, which I'm sure some of you must, please type them in the chat box, and we will move to our next presentation, and we'll answer all of the questions at the end. So at this point, I'd like to bring on Steve Weitzel and Russ Horner to talk to you about their program called Open Channel Systems.
Thank you, Marianne, for this opportunity to be part of the Innovations in Conservation program. We know that all utilities are dealing with different issues related to this pandemic, and we think that these tools can be useful to a lot of you. That's because the open channel system is a utility-minded demand analytics, communications, and auditing system that allows you to target the highest water users by segment. Our premise is you don't need to communicate with everyone, only the highest water users. Next slide. Hold on. There we go. We've built and deployed these systems with guidance from and funding from Salt Lake City's Department of Public Utilities, Utah State University's Center for Water Efficient Landscaping, plus technical and program guidance from Peter Mayer at Water Demand Management and Russ Horner at Water Management, Inc. As conservation managers, you know you need more data and a way to manage that data in order to build better programs. Policy decisions are not always data-driven, and these tools provide you with the information to influence, inform policy decisions, including programming, staffing, and budgets. We also know that utilities are swimming in data. IT departments can be overloaded. Conservation managers need access to data to analyze efficacy, and the Open Channel System is a comprehensive program to help conservation managers develop usage thresholds by market segments. We can then target, communicate, and audit the highest water users. Next slide. This conservation system was developed by Radian Developers. We are experts in software for water conservation, and we understand that no two utilities have the same mandates, budgets, or IT infrastructure. To that end, we've developed a water efficiency targets tool that allows you to identify the highest water users by segment, an enterprise communications portal for automated communications based on that data. We also have a slew of indoor and outdoor water audit programs for commercial and residential applications. Think of it more as a software conservation menu. Next slide. First, we're going to review the water efficiency targets tool, then the communications portal. Next slide. All right, so the water efficiency targets tool is a very powerful analytics program which mirrors the utility database and employs a NAICS classification system to compare apples to apples. We can use any classification system. We've chosen for Salt Lake City the NAICS classification system. This process helps define appropriate thresholds of usage by market segment. For our presentation, we're going to be reviewing restaurants in Tier 4. That's the highest water level tier, water usage tier for Salt Lake City. Next slide, please. So starting from the top here, we're going to identify food service, that is restaurants. And we have a whole lot of different ways to analyze and capture data to slice and dice. But we want to scroll down now to the bottom of the slide here is water consumption. We're going to look by tier. We want to look at anyone in Tier 4, which is again the highest water user level in Salt Lake City, who has had any bill in Tier 4, any 3 bills or more in Tier 4 for all months of 2019. Next slide. Okay, so these 21 restaurants meet those search parameters. Please note that this is actual data, consumption data, but we've put in fake names to protect personally identifiable information in this presentation. These restaurants can be exported to our enterprise communications portal, which we'll review in a few minutes, or added to a rebate or conservation program immediately. Next slide. We can also slice and dice by NAICS specific searches to identify the highest water users in each segment. So for example, in this search, we found a needle in a haystack, which is the top line here is a restaurant using 1,000% of average. These can also be exported to the enterprise communications portal or entered into a rebate or conservation program. Next slide. Okay, so drilling down to the service ID level, we can look at specific usage over 13 months. The restaurant Crystal Waters has a problem with summertime water usage. If you look in the bottom right, we can also see that in March, Crystal Waters was added to a conservation program number 6, which is titled Restaurants Full Service Tier 4. Next slide. We also gather additional information. This all helps feed into helping us define appropriate thresholds for water usage. We can identify the lot area, building square footage, year built, year of renovations is critical. But we can also add information about cooling towers, number of cooling towers, cycles of cooling towers, swimming pool information, car wash information, Lots of data goes into this system that is not necessarily in the utility billing data, but adds to our algorithm for defining water use thresholds. Next slide. Okay, so after we define our high water users, they can then be securely exported to our communications portal. For this, there's really 3 servers in play. We have the conservation server on the utility side, which is, again, a mirror of the utility database, so no information from this goes back into the master utility database. We have our open channel server, which helps ingest, aggregate, and process data. And for this situation, we're using Salesforce as a client relationship management tool, but we can use any CRM that the utility is using. In essence, we're using big business communications and analytics tools to increase revenue, not to increase revenue, but to increase conservation. The nuts and bolts of this is our proprietary system tokenizes the data between servers. So for example, service ID 12345 becomes A6789, and while both the utility and Salesforce know the token, Open Channel does not. Therefore, customer PII is protected, and there's no way to associate consumption with service ID, entity, address, or anything else on the Open Channel server. Next slide. Okay, so then the conservation manager can export this information of the high water users, full service tier 4 restaurants, into the communications portal, and they can either create a new email campaign or they can add to an existing campaign. Next slide. The communications portal allows you to create, again, automated or custom messaging. So for example, what we could do is anytime a restaurant is in tier 4, 3+ times in a 12-month period, they can receive an automated email or letter that includes them in a pre-rinse washer rebate program, for example, and also an audit program. Next slide. We also have irrigation, indoor, outdoor irrigation, and residential water use audit tools. For this, we're going to talk about our WaterCheck and GIS Landscape tools. Output reports from these tools deliver customized irrigation system and landscape action items and can inventory large commercial irrigation systems. Next slide. So the WaterCheck outdoor app captures irrigation and landscape information, including controller, make, and model. I'm just starting at the top here and working down the slide on the right. Controller, make, and model. We're looking at zone run times, zone days per week of irrigation, plant type, head type. But we also capture information that goes in slope and exposure, landscape action items, and irrigation action items. Next slide. We also collect distribution uniformity by zone to look at zone efficiency and capture also landscape measurements. So parcel measurements, hardscape, turf, other irrigated, all those go into an output report. Next slide. So basically based on inputs from the app aggregated with local ET and soil type, the homeowner gets an emailed output report including optimized runtime. So if you look at the top of the slide, we have the current runtime and then the optimized runtime if they make the updates to the system, fix broken pipes, fix broken heads, etc. We look at irrigation and landscape action items, distribution uniformity by zone, also a suggested days per week irrigation schedule. Next slide. Okay, our GIS Landscape Inventory application was developed collaboratively with Salt Lake City's GIS and IT departments, and this helps locate and inventory large irrigation systems like parks, schools, HOAs, systems we know are typically inefficient. Next slide. The GIS Landscape app allows for multiple in-field or desktop users to define attributes simultaneously. So for example, we can look at landscape area, zone area, controller type, and location. If you look at the red dot in the middle, that's a broken pipe. We want to identify where the controller is and what zones are associated with that controller. Next slide. Also, as irrigation or landscape items are fixed, facilities managers or utility admin can update the system to reflect these changes. So the result of this is an up-to-date irrigation system the inventory system for subsequent landscape professionals. We know what all the head types are. We know what head type is associated with what zone. We know what controllers control which zones. We know that historically there was mismatched head types and now they're not. So it's a full-blown irrigation inventory system, again, for large applications. It could be used on residential, but we feel like it's a much more successful tool to manage these large systems that were built 15 or 20 years ago. Next slide. Okay, so moving to indoor, we have 2 audit tools to help residential and commercial applications. For these applications, we're collaborating with Russ Horner at Water Management, Inc. Russ is going to present on the next several slides. Russ, next slide, please.
Thank you. Next slide. Thank you. Thank you, Mary Ann, for this webinar, and thank you, Steve. What Radian has put together is really incredible. Until Water Management met up with Radian, it took us hours, or in many cases days, to generate our water audit reports. The first tool that we developed with Radian was the residential water audit tool. This tool takes information regarding water fixture flow rates and is able to easily calculate repair costs and ROIs. It is important to understand that what makes this tool work so well is that the water rate and consumption information is populated into the property info information there in the top left part of the slide. Under other information, you can have the water rate, the sewer rate, and the annual water use. Next slide. By doing this, it will auto-generate the report for the resident within minutes. The second page of the residential report is on the right-hand side of the screen, and it identifies the flow rates of the various fixtures and the approximate cost to repair or replace them. Here we have Crystal Waters again. In her house, you can see that she has 3 different types of toilets. An older 3.5 gallon toilet, an HET toilet, and a ULF toilet. The ULF toilet typically flushes on 1/6, but often they get out of adjustment. So in this case, we might not recommend replacing it. We might just recommend repairing that toilet. Next slide. For us, the reason why it was so important to complete the residential audit tool first was because it serves as the backbone to the commercial audit tool. No matter what type of facility, whether it's a veterinary hospital in Pennsylvania or a cannery in Northern California, we must first quantify the human use. Remember about 10 slides ago, this is where the additional information related to cooling towers, laundry, ice machines, pools, landscape, that was all entered into the communication portal. That's the kind of information that is critical for us when we're doing the commercial audit. Next slide. And the goal, once again, with these commercial audits is to generate a water balance as quickly as possible. Having the water balance gives the client comfort in knowing that you understand their facility's water usage and are willing to help them identify ways in which they can save water. On this slide, the tendency by most would be to focus on the 50% usage related to the cooling tower use. But this is for a large office building, and the usage for the cooling tower was computed by understanding the number of tons, the full load cooling tower hours, and the degree days for the facility. To us, the most important slice of the pie is the unaccounted for water. In this case, it is 7%. As a rule of thumb, if it is less than 5%, or if it is negative, you may want to have the water meter tested for accuracy. If it is more than 10%, then it means that the likelihood of inefficiencies or leakage at the property is very high. Next slide. Once again, the auto-generated report provides a summary to the client of the suggested work to be done and the approximate cost. It also has a place for calculating energy savings and for applying rebates. Okay, Steve, it's back to you.
Thank you, Russ. Next slide. All right, so Russ was just talking about one house and one facility, but for conservation managers, this data can be aggregated to define which service IDs have gone over their budget. The Open Channel Admin Dashboards allows you to easily identify entities with extreme water usage relative to average or estimated thresholds for residential and commercial applications. Next slide. So pulling it all together, I'm going to start with additional data and then work our way clockwise. Additional data we talked about, that's number of cooling towers, number of times a day the cooling towers run, size of the swimming pool, seats in a restaurant, etc. We then pull in climate data. So we look at NOAA historical ET or 14-day forecasts for irrigation. We then pull in the tokenized billing data so it's secure. We don't see any personally identifiable information in our server. We also pull in data from the Water Efficiency Targets tool that allows us to identify the highest water users by segment. Then down to WaterCheck and GIS, we pull in the additional audit data from residential, commercial, indoor, outdoor programs. And then there's really two ways to communicate with the customer. If we want to define, for example, climate data, and we know it's going to rain in your area, we can program the system to send out an automated email to participants that says, it's going to rain in 3 days. If you don't have a water sensor, shut your system down for 3 days. And then we can send a note after, hey, it hasn't rained in 3 days, fire up your system. Or we can communicate, we can circumvent the automated communications, the custom communications, and we can go directly from an audit directly to the customer, so they have their output report in hand in their inbox that they can refer to for following up on recommendations. Next slide. So the potential irrigation savings. Now we're going to talk about potential savings indoors and out. It's important to note these are averages from what we're seeing on auditing commercial and industrial indoors and out. But if we're going to be able to target and understanding who the highest water users are, we're going to be able to see a higher return on investment here. So we know the average residential irrigation audit sees a reduction of 30%, and that's going to save about 3,500 gallons. And at 300 audits, that's 6 million gallons in 6 months. So we can save 1 million gallons a month. The average CII irrigation audit sees a larger savings, about 40%, and can save over 600,000 gallons an acre. Next slide. Okay, so the average residential audit will see a reduction of indoor audit. We'll see a reduction of 15 to 25%. And getting back to what Russ said, the average commercial audit is going to identify potential savings of 20 to 60%. Of course, we know that properties with higher estimated savings correlate with high unaccounted for water. Next slide. Okay, so targeting and water, targeting saves money and water. Our tools are designed for you to identify highest water users and communicate with those users directly. That is, if you have 500,000 connections, if we want to target the top 10 or 20% of the users, we know those are the highest water users in greatest need of conservation. Our tools allow you to identify these users and include them in rebate or audit programs and communicate directly with the decision makers, whether it's a homeowner or facilities manager. Next slide. Pulling it all together, the open channel system allows conservation managers to target and communicate again with the highest water users. You don't need to communicate with everybody. I'm sure communicating with Marianne or Liam is not going to get you anywhere. They're already efficient. You need to focus on the people and businesses that are inefficient. This further increases your conservation ROI. Conservation managers can then assign high water users to audits and rebates and show immediate program benefits. Lastly, and I think maybe more importantly, the data you can gather from this open channel system provides information you can use for policy, staffing, and budgeting. Next slide, please. That concludes. I think we came in right at 20 minutes. Thanks, Marianne.
Thank you so much, Steve and Russ, for this presentation. You say contact us for a free assessment and live demonstration. Is there, before we get to the questions, I just wanted to ask you what is the cost of your system? That'll be one of the
So
first questions probably people ask.
Of course, we've got a sliding scale. So for example, if you want to communicate with 50,000, it's going to be different pricing than if you need to communicate with 1 million customers or service IDs or connections. So we have a sliding scale on our costs for the different entities. For example, for the water efficiency targets tool, we can estimate anywhere from $1.28 a year per connection, all the way down to 33 cents a year per connection for up to 1 million connections. We have about the same pricing for the water efficiency for the communications portal. And the auditing, you know, I think we've priced it very reasonably for the auditing for the water check indoor residential and outdoor audits. We're looking at anywhere from $15 to $25 a use fee. And for the commercial audits, we're looking at about $300 per use. But really, I guess the trick is, it's really dependent on what the utility needs. So you might have a utility in Arizona that needs commercial indoor and outdoor only, or you could have a utility that's got an older development that needs to focus on indoor residential. So there's really not, this is custom. This is, I think, priced very reasonably, much less than other online tools in the market out there. But we want to be able to identify what the utility needs to dial in what the pricing ought to be.
Great, thank you. So while you're all typing in your questions into the chat box, just want to make some closing remarks. Want to thank you, of course, for joining us for this webinar. We appreciate your attendance. Please type in the questions into the chat box. We'll be happy to answer them. And if we, by any chance, run out of time and have not been able to answer all the questions, which today I think probably won't be the case, but if it's the case, you can always email us. We can answer your question electronically. We'll forward it to the speakers and get your question answered. We will have a PDF of this presentation posted within a day or two. And once we clean up the webinar recording, we'll post a link for the webinar recording as well. It'll be in the webinar page on our AWE website, which is located in the resources tab. And lastly, I just wanted to say we have 2 webinars coming up in June, and we want you to put them on your calendar. One is June 25th. We'll be talking about conservation programs for schools, getting students excited about water efficiency. And on June 30th, we will do our quarterly webinar with EPA. It's an outdoor webinar series that we do every quarter. And this time we're going to feature healthy landscape tips for your better yard. And we'll have some great examples for that. And so if you're not familiar with us, you probably, most of you are, but you can sign up for regular water efficiency news and events on our website. So we encourage you to do that. So at this point, I'd like to move to the questions. Liam, what do we have?
All right, thanks, Marianne. First couple questions are for JP. Does WaterWorth have water budget rates in the model?
So water budget rates, I understand, are in development. So that is one of the most recent types of rates, and of course it needs a lot more data. So currently no, but it is on the development cycle.
All right, and we have a question about if we'll be sending out a link with the summary details about the free trial, and we will be sending out a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation, so that'll have all the contact info that JP mentioned. And another question for you, JP. You say uploading billing data is optional. What are the rate scenarios based on, if not billing or consumption data?
So most of our customers are interested in just understanding what, an across-the-board increase to their rates is going to be needed to keep up with revenue requirements. And so when dealing with the financial model, the long-term financial model, when we're looking at, 4% increase, that assumes that you're increasing all of your rate components by 4% to generate that increase in revenue. It's only when you want to go what I call going under the hood and doing more forensic things with your rates, like if you only want to increase your tier rates or your block 2 rate, or you want to increase rates for residential but not commercial. Now we're not talking about a universal across the board increase. That's when we need the billing data. That's when we go into the rate editor and do the more comprehensive analysis. But for just run-of-the-mill across the board universal increases to rates over the next few years, so you can keep up with spending, that can be done very easily with the financial model.
All right, thank you. Actually, only one more question right now. Looks like this is for Steve. So if anybody else has a question, go ahead and type it in now. So how many cities are under mandates for water efficiency programs? Is it regulatory driven?
Boy, I'm a software developer, not a policy wonk. I don't have a good answer for that. Russ, would you know? Russ Horner?
Oh, golly, I do not. Yeah, sorry about that. I do not know. The question is, how many cities are currently under water restrictions?
Yeah, it says how many cities are under mandated water efficiency programs. I don't know if any of the other speakers want to weigh in on that, but.
So if I think I understand the question is, what are the regulatory drivers for water conservation programs that might be in place in municipalities? And if that's the question, most of those drivers come from state level initiatives. If you look at a state like California, they're going to be setting actual targets for their individual municipal and regional utilities to be complying with reductions in demand. And I think Texas also has requirements in their state water plan for making sure regions develop water conservation strategies that will help them meet their water supply goals on a long-term basis. And then there are communities that do ordinances that require more efficient plumbing fixtures, which is not the same thing as a conservation program per se, like Steve described in his open channel system. So it's to answer that question in terms of numbers. You can't say, well, there are 76 cities that have water conservation requirements. But if you're in the state of Florida, you've got a water management district that is probably telling you what your utility should and shouldn't do. So most of those directions do come from the state level. And if you're interested in how much of a regulatory impact that is, I encourage you to take a look at the Alliance for Water Efficiency State Scorecard, which is also posted on our website. We analyze all of the state water efficiency policies that drive the implementation of water efficiency conservation programs. So take a look at that. But primarily, water conservation programs are driven by economics and water scarcity. So those are the two big drivers that we see in our work.
Okay, and yeah, that's all we have for questions right now. Both of the presentations were very thorough. So unless any others come in the next few seconds, I guess that's all we have. Okay,
well, let me ask a question while I have you guys here, because I think the software development that both of you have talked about is really interesting. So JP, if you could talk a little bit about the kinds of clients that you have for your WaterWorth system, how they vary in terms of size, how they vary in terms of complexity. Can you give us a little bit of a snapshot? You showed us a map of all the states that you work in, which was impressive, but can you tell us a little bit about your typical utility customer?
Yeah, and I need to make a correction. So I've been told that our software does support water budget rates. So I stand corrected by my own colleagues. So whoever asked that question, hopefully they're still online. If they want to talk that through some more, I'm happy to review that with them. Our customers tend to be the small and medium-sized municipalities. So we've got some as small as 1,000, 2,000 connections, and we've got I think our biggest customers are running 150,000 population, kind of in that range. So small and medium-sized municipalities, we do water and wastewater and stormwater. And WaterWorth is actually growing up and starting to look at other government services as well. So, and all because of this pandemic, we've been helping a lot of our existing customers model their general fund. And so, as far as the financial modeling goes, the math is really all still much the same. And so the power of WaterWorth has become really helpful to having you know, our customers kind of look at a COVID-19 scenario of, you know, what if we lose some revenues from sales tax, and what if we lose, you know, a big industrial customer? What's that going to do? So, hope that answers your question, Marianne.
Yeah, that's interesting. So your system can work with a system as small as 2,000 connections.
It can, and let me say this too. So as the systems get smaller, you know, they're more resource strapped, and our price point begins to get a bit expensive for the smallest of systems. So we've been in communication with the National Rural Water Association in the U.S. So they're based out of Duncan, Oklahoma, and they are a very broad network. So every state has its own rural water association, and we're working out a deal to bring WaterWorth to the smallest of systems out there for a much reduced price than what I showed on the screen. But that'll depend on whichever states decide to participate. So, you know, a message out to, I don't know how many really small systems are on the call now, but if they ever get a chance to see this webinar, we are promising to deliver WaterWorth for as low as $1 per serviced population per year as a subscription rate. So really exciting to be working with NRWA, and you know, really exciting to be able to help those of the smallest systems who don't have the economies of scale and really could use the help and just don't have the money to pay the higher prices.
Okay, thank you. Steve and Russ, I have a question for you about your system. It looks very data intensive. Does all of the data have to come from the utility itself? How are all of your fields populated?
Great. So we do pull in a lot of data from the utility, consumption data, et cetera, but then we aggregate data from we have an API with NOAA for weather data, and then the water efficiency targets for Salt Lake City. Specifically, we're actively contacting businesses, identifying how many seats are in the restaurants, identifying what the business is. Salt Lake City has a number of unidentified businesses in their database, so we're updating that. So it's a combination of what the utility has, what comes from NOAA, what comes from the auditing programs.
So it isn't populated by the businesses themselves.
And also,
data that's collected.
Go ahead, Russ, and I'll answer your question, Marianne.
In many cases, this is Russ. In many cases, a lot of our data is coming from what we know about the facility, what we can gather online. If it's a hotel, we will get the occupancy data, and then we'll know how many times the guests are showering. We'll know how much laundry is necessary based on the type of hotel that it is. If it's a hospital, we're going to have all sorts of data based upon beds, and we're really going to be able to understand the size of the cooling tower in many cases without even going, by knowing what the square footage, by looking online. So we can gather a lot of information before we have to even ask the client. Whatever we can gather from them is just makes the water balance that much more accurate. But what we need mostly from the utility to begin with is the water data.
Okay, thank you.
So in our system, Marianne, we gather this information and we help the utility set up automated communications based on what their needs are. So not all utilities have the same demands and needs and requirements. We want to be able to work with the utility and say, okay, outdoor, you know, you've got your area has a problem with irrigation for parks and recreation. Let's create a program based on that. But it could be that you want to run a commercial audit program, and we can pull that data in also. So it's really customizable.
Great, thank you. So Liam, do we have any more questions for our speakers?
We have not had any more questions come in, unfortunately.
Okay, well, I thank you, speakers, for being so, economizing with your time. We really appreciate it. And I think our attendees won't mind if we finish a little early. So at this point, I want to, again, thank everybody for attending the webinar, and, invite you to attend our webinars going forward in June 25th and June 30th. And thank you very much for being part of this Innovations in Efficiency webinar series.
Okay, thanks, Marianne, and
Thank you.
yeah, and thanks for the
all.
hard work behind the scenes. You and Liam did a great job. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
That was exciting. Thank you, Marianne and Liam and JP and Russ and everybody else.